When she flung yogurt across the school cafeteria, everyone wrote her off as just another rebellious kid. But in the principal's office, her startling confession was the moment everything changed. Raven slumped against the cold, mustard-colored wall just outside the principal's office, her arms folded across her chest in a silent declaration of defiance. Yet if one looked closely, there was no true rebellion in her eyes, only a hollow fatigue, as though the weight of the world pressed down on her small shoulders. Her gaze drifted aimlessly from the peeling paint on the lockers to the worn-out shoes on her feet. It was hard to say which detail bothered her more, the solemn hush of the hallway or the fact that she was utterly numb to her own predicament. Principal Jason Smith stood a few steps away, clipboard in hand, observing the 12-year-old. He noticed the tension in her posture, the way her breathing grew shallow whenever the door behind her creaked with the possibility of someone emerging. Most students in her position would show at least a glimmer of apprehension, maybe fidgeting, maybe apologizing under their breath, but not Raven. She sat there as if she had seen it all before and expected nothing less than the worst. A faint overhead light flickered, casting eerie shadows that stretched and receded along the corridor. It gave the impression of a scene frozen in time, a weary child and a concerned administrator suspended in a moment that neither understood completely. Jason had encountered plenty of rule breakers, bullies, and troublemakers over his long career. But something about Raven felt different. He couldn't pinpoint what it was yet. Perhaps her posture that screamed resignation rather than rebelliousness, or maybe the hollow gaze that suggested she'd grown tired of life's battles long before she stepped into 6th grade. As he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, Jason recalled the call from a lunch monitor about a violent outburst. But looking at Raven now, the label violent didn't seem to fit. Her silence spoke volumes. However, she was used to waiting for punishment. She was prepared for it as though it were just another routine chore on a never-ending list of letdowns. Her hands tightened over her forearms in a self-protective gesture. Maybe she was trying to hold herself together, or perhaps she was reminding herself that no one else would ever do it for her. Jason exhaled slowly, sensing that he was not merely dealing with a disciplinary issue, but teetering on the edge of uncovering a deeper, more unsettling story. A swirl of questions raced through his mind, yet he chose not to interrogate her on the spot. Instead, he quietly pushed the door open, readying himself to learn who Raven really was, and why her eyes seemed to have lost all spark of hope long before she had arrived in his office. The cafeteria on that chilly autumn day was a cacophony of clattering trays, hurried footsteps, and overlapping voices, some friendly, some teasing. Bent fluorescent lights hummed overhead, lending a harsh glow that made the bright posters on nutrition and good behavior look oddly out of place. In the midst of this lively chaos sat Raven, hunched at the far edge of a long lunch table, barely touching the food on her tray. She had learned to shrink into the background wherever she went, a deliberate invisibility. If they don't notice me, maybe they won't mock me, she told herself. But that day, fate, or perhaps cruelty, had other plans. A trio of students sidled up to her, trading whispered insults behind cupped hands. At first, Raven tried to ignore them, picking at her meal, keeping her head down. She caught snippets of their conversation drifting to her ears. No parents, foster kid, probably trouble. Each phrase latched onto her heart with painful familiarity. She felt heat blooming in her cheeks. Her knuckles went white from gripping her spoon too tightly. A humiliating flush crept up her neck when one of the girls sneered. "I heard she's been in like 10 different homes. Bet no one wants her for long." Another let out a taunting laugh, echoing against the cafeteria walls. Raven's pulse quickened. She knew it was unwise to respond. She had, after all, endured worse. Yet something about that moment, the laughter, the pitying eyes of onlookers, the sense of being cornered, gnawed at her. She thought of every dismissal, every door slammed in her face. An anger, raw and unsteady, welled up inside her. Before she even realized what she was doing, her hand shot forward, hurling a cup of yogurt in the direction of the closest taunter. Time seemed to slow. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the container soared, flipping end over end, its contents splattering across the student's shirt. For an instant, the cafeteria fell ominously silent. The laughter ceased. Raven could practically hear her own heart thudding in her chest. Then came the wave of commotion, exclamations, shrieks of disgust, and the rapid footsteps of the lunch monitor rushing to the scene. Raven didn't move. She didn't apologize. She didn't flinch. It wasn't that she felt proud or justified. It was the emptiness again, a cold certainty that she had broken some unspoken rule and would now face the standard punishment. Teachers swarmed her, voices merging into an incoherent blur. "Principal's office," someone said, dragging her away. She barely resisted. In her mind, the outcome was already predetermined. This was just another chapter in a long, repetitive story, one in which she always stood alone. Inside the principal's office, Jason leaned against the sturdy oak desk, arms folded, studying Raven as she lingered by the door. The tension crackled in the air, thick with unspoken questions. He asked carefully, "Would you have done that in a restaurant? Thrown food at someone like that?" Raven's eyes flickered with something between confusion and defiance. She shrugged. "I've never been to a restaurant," she said flatly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason found himself momentarily speechless, caught off guard by the stark honesty behind such a simple statement. He felt the words sink in like a sudden weight on his chest. All the assumptions about her behavior, all the usual lectures he had prepared, none of it made sense now. This wasn't just another rebellious kid looking for attention. This was someone who'd had opportunities snatched away before they even presented themselves. In that charged silence, Jason realized this moment wasn't about discipline alone. It was about listening, about seeing a lost child instead of a troublemaker. So he drew a breath, gently placed a hand on the paperwork for Raven's suspension, and spoke in a calm voice, ready to hear what she had to say next. Raven was only 6 years old when she first felt the wrenching sensation of a stranger's hand gripping hers, guiding her away from the only place she had momentarily called home. She remembered the stifling smell of disinfectant and stale air as a social worker led her outside, the woman's voice a blur of tired reassurances. The late afternoon sun glared harshly, and Raven squinted, trying to hold back tears. She didn't fully understand what was happening, only that she was leaving again. Her new destination was yet another foster home in a string of temporary stops that seemed never-ending. Each house had its own odd rules and routines. A strict bedtime, limited snacks, certain chores no one else wanted to do. Some families were kind enough to give her small comforts, a warm blanket, a gentle word at bedtime, but remained distant, as though afraid to get too attached. Others treated her like a burden, handing her off to babysitters or leaving her alone with the TV. She learned quickly to be polite, obedient, and invisible, hoping that this would make her stay last longer. In one particular home, the foster parents seemed almost angelic at first. They painted her bedroom walls in a soft lavender shade and surprised her with a stuffed rabbit on her second night there. The woman called herself Mom around Raven, and the man would scoop her up in a big hug when he came home from work, proclaiming, "There's my little girl." Raven felt cautious hope bloom inside her, a fragile light in the otherwise gray world she inhabited. They told her they wanted to keep her forever, whispering promises of adoption papers and a life where she would never have to pack a suitcase again. For a time, Raven dared to believe she might finally belong. She drew bright pictures of the three of them, stick figures with smiling faces, and taped them to the fridge. She tried hard in school, hoping to make them proud. But the day came when an argument erupted between the couple. Raven never knew the details, only that it ended in slammed doors and accusations about finances. In the emotional fallout, the decision was made to give her up. One morning, the social worker arrived, suitcase in hand, and Raven's heart sank. The man and woman who once called her their daughter avoided eye contact, leaving the rabbit she cherished behind on the empty bed. She was ushered into another car, onto another lonely road. Staring out the window, Raven let the tears spill quietly this time. The promise of forever lay shattered in her mind, and as she watched houses blur by, her small hands clutched the seatbelt. She told herself she wouldn't trust so easily again. If love and stability could vanish that quickly, what was the point of believing in them? Somewhere between her ninth and 10th foster placement, Raven found herself walking past a brightly lit restaurant hand in hand with a guardian who seemed perpetually in a hurry. The restaurant's windows revealed a scene that felt almost unreal. A family seated at a table decorated with flickering candles, laughing and clinking their glasses. Two children tore into their dinner rolls while their mother playfully scolded them for making a mess. Warmth emanated from the interior, a glow of comfort and belonging that made Raven pause in her tracks. Her guardian tugged impatiently at her arm. "Come on, we're late," the woman said curtly, not bothering to explain or even glance through the window. Raven stumbled forward, her eyes lingering on the family's laughter until it disappeared behind a closing door. She had no idea what a restaurant meal actually tasted like, nor how it would feel to be surrounded by people who enjoyed each other's company without the ominous ticking of a clock counting down to the next relocation. In that moment, as the streetlights flickered overhead, Raven understood something deeply unsettling. She was not like the children she had just seen. Their world was secure, a bubble of affectionate teasing and shared meals. Hers was one of constant upheaval, a life lived out of boxes and garbage bags, hastily filled whenever it was time to move on. She realized, with an ache she could hardly name, that the simple pleasure of dining out with family was an experience she might never know. Over the years, Raven taught herself to smile mechanically when strangers asked if she liked her current home. She nodded politely, suppressing the sting of knowing there was nothing truly current about any place she stayed. In her mind, each foster arrangement was already marked with an expiration date, looming like a storm cloud. She learned that trust was dangerous. It was a fragile glass figurine that always shattered in the end. One chilly winter night, in a cramped townhouse where she'd been placed temporarily, Raven lay awake in bed. The thin walls did little to block out the voices in the next room. Her foster parents were talking about her, their complaints audible through the rattling heat vents. "She's quiet, but it's still one more mouth to feed," one of them muttered. The other groaned in agreement. "We'll ask the agency if they can transfer her sooner rather than later." A cold knot of fear lodged itself in Raven's chest, but she didn't cry. She had shed too many tears over too many broken promises. Instead, she stared at the ceiling, counting each speck in the plaster as a way to calm herself. If she listened closely, she thought she could hear her heartbeat steadying, a dull thud that reminded her she was still alive, still human, still deserving of love, even if no one else seemed to believe it. Yet the next morning, she acted as though she'd heard nothing. She got dressed, ate a silent breakfast, and trudged off to school, doing all she could to remain unnoticed. Because in her mind, it was better to be invisible than to risk another rejection. She had locked her hurts away so deeply that not even she could fully articulate them. There was no point in hoping for miracles. After all, every time she dared to imagine a future in which she truly belonged, reality came crashing down harder, reminding her that permanency was a luxury she might never afford. Jason Smith's office was a modest space filled with rows of educational journals, inspirational posters, and photos of grinning students. But on that particular evening, he found himself unable to focus on any of it. He sat behind his wooden desk, tapping a pencil against a stack of files labeled foster care forms. Mary Beth, his wife, stood by the door, her eyes scanning Jason's face. She could see he was troubled, haunted even. They had been here before, the glimmer of hope, the spark of possibility, and the risk of heartbreak. Years earlier, they had fostered a set of siblings, two bright-eyed girls who loved puzzles and dancing to loud music in the living room. Jason and Mary Beth had envisioned a future for them all, complete with weekend camping trips and matching Christmas pajamas. But after a few months, the courts decided it was best to reunite those children with their biological family. The Smiths did not contest the decision, knowing how vital reunification could be, yet the loss stung. The house felt oddly quiet afterward, an echo of what could have been. Mary Beth ran her fingertips over a laminated certificate on the desk, A training completion for foster parents, proof of their readiness. "We said we wouldn't do this again," she murmured, her voice trembling just enough for Jason to notice. "We promised ourselves. It was too painful." Jason sighed, leaning back in his chair. He remembered his conversation with Raven, the way she'd mumbled that she had never been to a restaurant, the emptiness in her eyes that spoke of a lifetime of disappointments. "But this girl, there's something different about her," he said softly. "I saw her in the school library today. She was reading a book on family bonds. She looked so lost." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I can't just ignore that, Mary Beth. We might be the only chance she has." His wife closed her eyes, recalling how, despite their efforts to move forward, they could never shake the sense that they were meant to parent. Every corner of their home felt like it was missing the sound of a child's laughter. Still, the memory of the last heartbreak lingered, cautioning them against hasty decisions. "What if we're not strong enough to handle it again?" she asked, her voice quivering. Jason reached for her hand, giving it a firm, reassuring squeeze. "Maybe we're exactly as strong as we need to be," he replied. In that moment, the distance between them, the uncertainty, the fear seemed to shrink. They both understood the stakes. Fostering Raven meant reopening old wounds, risking another painful goodbye. Yet neither could dismiss the possibility that this time might be different. With a determined nod, Mary Beth stepped closer. "Let's do this," she said. "But promise me, Jason, if it becomes too much, we tell each other. No secrets." He agreed, and together they gathered the paperwork. Each signature felt like a step over the edge of a cliff, but also a leap of faith. Little did they know that the journey they were about to embark on would test them in ways they never anticipated, and possibly heal them in ways they'd only dreamed. On Raven's first night at the Smiths' home, she looked around the neatly furnished bedroom as though expecting it to disappear. A quilt with bright patchwork colors lay on the bed, and a small bookshelf stood in the corner, stocked with new notebooks and pencils. Mary Beth had fussed over every detail, hoping to make the space feel personal. But Raven didn't utter a word of appreciation or delight. Instead, she placed her worn duffel bag on the floor, glanced around with tired eyes, and mumbled a half-hearted thanks before shutting the door. In the days that followed, it became clear that Raven's defense mechanisms ran deep. She rarely spoke unless asked a direct question. At mealtimes, she often excused herself early, leaving her plate half-finished. When Mary Beth tried to discuss school assignments or suggest a family movie night, Raven responded with shrugs or one-syllable answers. It wasn't outright defiance. It was distance, like she was living behind an invisible wall, one she had carefully constructed over years of disappointment. But then came the moments that felt like tiny earthquakes. Raven would break a dish, claim it was an accident, and watch Jason's face for anger. Or she'd stay out late at the library after school without telling anyone, returning to find Mary Beth worriedly pacing the front porch. Each time they showed patience or concern, Raven seemed perplexed, as though she expected to be scolded or shoved aside. And each time she wasn't, she grew more restless, testing them further, searching for proof that they'd ultimately give up on her just like everyone else had. The real breaking point arrived on a stormy Thursday evening. Rain pounded the windows, and thunder rattled the frames. Raven had locked herself in her room after an argument over a lost homework assignment. Rather than talking it out, she climbed through the bedroom window and vanished into the dark. Mary Beth noticed the open window a short while later, her heart plunging into her stomach. She called Jason, who was still at school finishing paperwork. Within minutes, they were both in the car, headlights cutting through sheets of rain as they scoured the neighborhood. Fear clung to Mary Beth's every breath. All she could think about was how Raven might have slipped away for good this time. Maybe she'd decide they weren't worth the risk, that she was better off alone. Jason gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, scanning each sidewalk and bus stop, calling out Raven's name. The wipers swished back and forth, a frantic rhythm echoing their racing hearts. They finally found her near the edge of a deserted park, drenched to the bone, hugging her knees beneath a flickering street lamp. She looked up with wide, haunted eyes as they pulled over. Jason jumped out first, running through the downpour, not caring that his shoes sank into muddy grass. He crouched beside Raven, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "We've been looking everywhere," he said, his voice trembling more from emotion than the cold. "You should have just let me go," she muttered, her lips quivering. "You'll get rid of me sooner or later." Mary Beth, tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks, knelt beside them. "We are not giving up on you," she said firmly. In one swift motion, she wrapped her arms around Raven, pulling her close despite the wet clothes and the chill in the air. Jason joined the embrace, his warmth enveloping both of them. The storm raged on, but in that moment, there was an odd sense of calm, a tiny oasis of belonging. As they helped Raven into the car, Mary Beth repeated quietly, "We won't leave you, no matter what." And though Raven's response was a silent nod, something in her expression shifted. A fragile spark of hope flickered behind her guarded eyes. Maybe, just maybe, this home wouldn't vanish like all the others. Back at the house, they wrapped her in blankets, offered hot cocoa, and let her know they were relieved she was safe. No lectures, no punitive measures, only relief and a reaffirmation of their commitment. Sitting there in the living room, listening to the rain subside, Raven finally allowed herself to believe that Jason and Mary Beth might truly mean it. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she dared to consider that forever might not be an empty promise after all. Raven's life had begun to settle into a cautious routine at the Smith household. She was still wary, still prone to bristle at any sign of judgment, but she no longer flinched when Mary Beth offered a hug, nor did she snap at Jason's gentle attempts at fatherly humor. Then, just when she started believing in the fragile stability she had found, trouble erupted at school, testing not only her trust in the Smiths, but also her own budding sense of self-worth. It all started when a classmate reported that someone had stolen a small amount of money from a backpack left in the locker room. The rumor mill spun rapidly, and before long, fingers began pointing at Raven. Whispers trailed her in the hallway. She could feel them creeping along like shadows. One teacher, who had never tried to hide her skepticism about foster kids, confronted Raven in front of the entire class. "Let's not beat around the bush," she said, lips pursed in disapproval. "Children who move from home to home often have difficulty understanding boundaries. If the money is returned, no questions will be asked." Raven's cheeks burned with a mix of anger and humiliation. She hadn't taken anything. Yet the teacher's insinuation rolled off her tongue like a foregone conclusion. Foster children are prone to theft. An uncomfortable silence hung in the air, broken only by the shuffling of notebooks and the quiet clearing of throats. Some classmates looked away, others stared openly, devouring the spectacle. By the time Raven managed to stammer a denial, she could tell no one believed her. Fear and resignation bubbled up in her chest. "They'll kick me out for sure," she thought, remembering all the times she'd been labeled trouble without any chance to defend herself. With a sense of grim finality, she slipped out of the classroom once the bell rang, ducking into a deserted stairwell to gather her thoughts. When Jason learned of the accusation, he immediately called the school board, demanding a fair investigation. Mary Beth insisted on speaking to the principal, refusing to allow a biased teacher's assumptions to tarnish Raven's name. Raven, however, was convinced the Smiths would soon revoke their promises. She prepared to run, methodically shoving her few belongings into a battered duffel bag. The heartbreak of leaving was familiar territory. She was determined to leave on her own terms before they told her to go. But that evening, as she crept downstairs, she found Jason and Mary Beth waiting in the living room. Jason's voice was calm but firm. "We're not letting them pin this on you without proof," he said, meeting Raven's eyes. "You're our daughter, and we stand by you." Those words, "our daughter," hit Raven harder than any accusation. In that moment, the weight of her duffel bag slipped from her fingers. Despite her lingering doubt, she allowed herself to listen as Mary Beth knelt beside her, hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," Mary Beth said, voice steady with conviction. "We're fighting for you, Raven, and we always will." The investigations took time, but eventually the truth emerged. Another student had taken the money on a dare and lied to avoid punishment. The principal apologized publicly to Raven, and the teacher who had voiced her prejudices was officially reprimanded. Raven's eyes shone with tentative relief. For once in her life, not only was she vindicated, but the people who claimed to love her proved they wouldn't abandon her at the first sign of trouble. The uneasy calm that followed the false theft accusation was soon disrupted by an even more personal challenge. One crisp afternoon, Raven returned from school to find an unfamiliar car in the driveway, a figure waiting on the Smith's porch, a woman whose face carried the weight of old regrets. The moment Raven locked eyes with her, a chill ran down her spine. It was Mrs. Parker, a former guardian who had once overseen one of Raven's foster placements. Mrs. Parker's mouth quivered into what might have been an apologetic smile as Raven approached. "You've grown," she murmured, her tone laden with a guilt she couldn't quite mask. Jason and Mary Beth stood close by, arms folded, protective but measured, unsure how to navigate this unexpected reunion. Raven's mind spun with conflicting memories. Mrs. Parker had been strict and often distant, yet there were fleeting moments of kindness, like the time she bought Raven a puzzle set after a particularly tough day. But in the end, as with so many, she too had let Raven go without much explanation. I made mistakes," Mrs. Parker said, her voice trembling. "I was under a lot of stress, and, well, I've regretted letting you leave ever since. I want to make it right. I'd like you to come back. Live with me again. We can start fresh." A heavy silence draped over the porch. Raven felt a tangled mess of emotions: anger, curiosity, desperation for closure. She glanced at Jason and Mary Beth, who offered no immediate protest. Instead, Mary Beth gently squeezed Raven's shoulder. "This is your decision," she said softly. "We love you, and we want you to stay, but we won't force you." Raven's heart pounded. The old her would have leapt at the chance to keep everyone at arm's length, to mistrust any promise of permanence. Mrs. Parker's arrival represented the past, familiar, yet painful. Could she ever forgive the woman for abandoning her in the first place? Did she even want to? Standing beside Jason, Raven recalled the countless nights she had gone to sleep uncertain if the next day would tear her away again. But here she was, at the threshold of a real home, the Smiths having stood by her side through accusations and misunderstandings. She hesitated, feeling Mrs. Parker's pleading stare bore into her. Finally, Raven spoke in a subdued voice. "I've spent a long time thinking no one wanted me. Then Jason and Mary Beth showed me that family can be real, even if it doesn't start that way." She paused, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry you feel regret, but I'm not leaving." Mrs. Parker nodded numbly, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. She tried to say something, but could only manage a faint apology before she turned and walked back to her car. Raven watched as the vehicle disappeared down the street, her chest heavy with a strange mix of relief and sadness. Jason and Mary Beth enveloped her in a warm hug, and Raven realized for the first time that she was no longer questioning whether they would keep her. This was her house, her home. In that lingering twilight, Raven understood what it meant to choose her own future. She had taken a stand, not out of obligation, but out of love for the family who had chosen her. The past, with all its bruises and betrayals, could not eclipse the bond she was now free to accept. It wasn't about erasing old scars, but about writing a new chapter where she was finally more than just a name on a folder. She was a daughter, too. Not long after the dust settled from the unexpected visit of her former guardian, Raven found herself in the kitchen of the Smith household, helping Mary Beth roll out dough for what would become a home-cooked pizza. The atmosphere was cozy, sprinkled with laughter as flour dusted their hands. Jason, in a goofy apron, hovered nearby, teasing Mary Beth about her secret sauce. In the early days, Raven would have observed such banter with a detached wariness, but now she wore a soft smile, even adding the occasional playful comment of her own. While shaping the dough, she absent-mindedly reached for a measuring cup. "Mom, can you pass the salt?" she asked, voice steady and casual, as though she'd said those words a million times before. The room seemed to freeze in that moment. Mary Beth paused, her eyes widening, and she let the cup slip from her fingers onto the counter. Without warning, tears began to brim in her eyes. Raven's heart skipped a beat when she realized what she had just said. She braced herself, half expecting Mary Beth to question or dismiss it. But instead, Mary Beth let out a tremulous laugh and enveloped Raven in a tight embrace. "You have no idea how long I've waited for that," she managed between sobs. Raven, though initially startled, found herself relaxing into the hug, tears prickling at the corners of her own eyes. The significance of that single word, Mom, was not lost on Raven. It wasn't forced. It wasn't scripted. It simply slipped out, a natural product of safety and warmth she had started to believe in. Jason stood by, a proud smile tugging at his lips, as though he'd just witnessed a long-awaited miracle. A few days later, in celebration of Raven's slow but steady embrace of their family bond, Jason decided to take her to a small Italian restaurant on the outskirts of town. It was well-lit and bustling with the aromas of garlic and simmering tomatoes. The moment Raven stepped inside, she felt an odd mix of anticipation and unease. She had grown accustomed to dining with the Smiths at home, but the swirl of clinking cutlery and soft conversation in this public space felt foreign, almost overwhelming. Jason guided her toward a cozy booth by a window. He and Mary Beth waited patiently while she looked over the menu, eyes scanning the unfamiliar dishes. But more than the words on the menu, Raven was captivated by the families around them. Parents coaxing picky toddlers to try a bite of pasta, friends laughing as they toasted some unspoken triumph. She remembered times she had peered through restaurant windows from the outside, a bystander to other people's warmth. Now, as she sipped a cold glass of water and listened to Jason and Mary Beth debate over whether to order extra garlic bread, the realization sank in. She wasn't on the outside anymore. She was part of the hubbub, part of that shared laughter and comfortable closeness. In the reflection of the window, she could see her own face, no longer carrying the perpetual uncertainty she once wore like a shield. She was no longer a visitor in other people's lives. She belonged right here with the Smiths. Time has a way of softening even the deepest wounds, especially when love and persistence are applied daily. By the time Raven finished high school, she had forged a path that many had once deemed unimaginable. Encouraged by Jason and Mary Beth's unwavering support, she pursued higher education with a newfound sense of purpose. She enrolled in a social work program at a nearby university, driven by a desire to help children who, like her, had once felt untethered and unseen. The campus buzzed with energy, and Raven found that her experiences gave her a unique empathy. While other students studied theories in textbooks, she had lived them. She understood the quiet desperation of a child clinging to hope in a world that seemed determined to disappoint. More than that, she grasped the importance of having even one adult who truly believed in your potential. Her professors quickly recognized her maturity and insight, and she dove into volunteer opportunities at local shelters, lending a listening ear and a compassionate heart to kids whose struggles mirrored her own past. Then, one afternoon, as Raven finished a shift at a community outreach center, a shy 14-year-old approached her. The girl's hair was tied in a messy ponytail, her eyes flickering with the same guarded wariness Raven herself had once carried. Clutching a worn backpack to her chest, the teenager took a moment before speaking. "Are you the one who was in foster care?" she whispered, as though half afraid of the answer. Raven nodded. "I was, yes," she replied softly. The girl exhaled, relief flashing across her face. She confessed that she had heard Raven's story in a school presentation, a story about a frightened foster kid who discovered that family wasn't defined by blood, but by unwavering loyalty and love. "I didn't know it was possible," the girl said, voice trembling, "to find a forever home after so much, after everything." She paused, eyes glistening. "Your story gives me hope." Raven felt her own throat tighten, emotion welling up from a place deep inside. She gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "If it helped you," she said, smiling through the tears that threatened to spill, "then every hard moment I went through was worth it." That night, Raven returned home to the Smiths. Her home, now as much as it had ever been. Jason and Mary Beth kept a family photo album on the coffee table, each page chronicling milestones. Raven's first day of high school, camping trips, birthdays, holiday dinners. Flipping through the snapshots, she paused at one particular photo, a grinning 12-year-old Raven standing in the Smiths' living room, still wearing that tough, hesitant expression. Mary Beth and Jason flanked her, their eyes shining with promise. She leaned back, closing the album gently, a gentle smile curving her lips. For a moment, she allowed herself to dwell on the distance she had traveled. From the child who peered through restaurant windows, convinced she'd never have a family to call her own, to the young woman committed to guiding others toward the light she had found. She felt a wave of gratitude and certainty wash over her. Life had changed in ways she'd never dared to dream, and she knew, as she set the album aside, that this was only the beginning of the hope and healing she could share with the world.